everyone, I'm Sarah Beth Morgan and I'm a freelance illustrator and art director from Portland, Oregon. I'm also an instructor for Skillshare and School of Motion, and I am super excited that you joined us today for this Adobe Lab. Nol Honig and I will go into detail about animating your designs from scratch. We're really focusing on teaching technique to those of y'all who haven't really dove into After Effects yet, to those of you who might be really into design and illustration, but you want to add some more motion to your work. So you've definitely come to the right place. That's what this 4-part lab series is all about. And to give you some context, here is what our final product will look like at the end of the 4 parts, after I talk about design and Nol designs into some motion and After Effects. Today in part 1, we'll focus in on the beginning stages, researching and concepting. I'll kind of go into a little bit of backstory about what different levels of motion there are and how you can implement those into your future work. And then we'll also start in Photoshop and we'll learn how to create a Photoshop file from scratch that actually will work really well to bring into After Effects later. Feel free to ask questions in the chat pod. I'll do my best to answer them. And again, we're just so happy that you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's get started. All right, y'all, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of designing for animation, I want to pull back the curtain a bit on the different levels of motion design we encounter in the world. Here in this lab, we'll be honing in on level 1, which involves very subtle movement, often added for a little extra pizzazz on editorial illustrations or on websites, or sometimes in social media posts. These are typically looping gifs, mostly created with simple keyframe animation in After Effects, which Nol will go into a bit more later. I'd say level 1 is most suited to visual designers or illustrators who are just getting their feet wet with After Effects in motion design or animation. I'd say it's a great first step to take. And here are some examples of what I mean. So this first animation I have here is by Lynn Fritz. She's a colleague of mine in the industry. She's an amazing freelancer. But I love this subtle bug animation she's got going on, just a couple of things moving around the frame. It's looping, so it can kind of just be stared at forever. And then we have this other GIF by Morgan Romberg. The great thing about this one is that it doesn't even use much ease, which Nol will talk about later. It's just kind of like a steppy animation of this wave passing over the glasses. So it's pretty simple and it all happens very quickly. This is all very subtle. And this is the kind of animation we'll be focusing on here in this lab. Level 2 is what I would call Instagram post level. Maybe there's a little transition or a big sweeping movement involved. These are more complex than level 1 animations, but not as intense as creating a full-on short film or a narrative story arc, character animation, 3D animation. It doesn't involve that just quite yet. A lot of times, these are tidbits taken from larger animations, like, if an animator wants to show their process on Instagram, they might take a piece of that and just post that. But these are just usually created as loops for social media. And here are some examples. So this first one is animated by Tyler Morgan, designed by Yuki Yamada at Oddfellows, and I just love how we have one object transforming into another. And I would say this is a great example of a looping social media GIF. Then we have this GIF by Jamie Jones, a really beautiful, simple line work illustration of a can crushing. This would probably be done more in Cell than After Effects. We have this smiling parallel teeth animation, and we also have this other character animation by Jackie Wong. I would say that level 2 animation doesn't really involve character animation, but you can have characters with subtle animated movement. Perhaps, they're just looking at something above, like in Jackie's illustration, or it's just a face making one expression. I would say that's level 2. Level 3 opens us up to an entire world of animation and motion. I would say we could label about 10 levels of motion if I were to get really specific here. But for time's sake, let's just say level 3 is a full-on Vimeo video. It's like a short film or passion project. It could even be a feature-length animation. These level 3 animations can feature evolving styles out of 2D animation, 3D animation, or even stop motion. It can incorporate film or experimental techniques. So it can go a lot of ways. If we look into the world of motion as a whole, there's just so much you can do with it. Most videos you'll find in level 3 are not usually created by one individual, Most of these are designed and animated by a large team of creatives. And in most cases, the designers will pass off their Photoshop or illustration files to animators to be completed. In my professional career, this level is what I focus on most, but I actually don't animate a lot of my own illustrations, hence why I have Nol here to bring one of my illustrations to life. So I think in a motion-minded way, but I don't necessarily have the skill to go into After Effects and do it all myself. I prefer to stay in Photoshop and make things look beautiful and create story arcs and all of that. So that's kind of where I'm at. And we'll look at some examples of level 3 videos now. This first one I'm showing you was actually created by myself and my husband, Tyler Morgan. I actually showed you one of his gifs earlier, but this is an example of a project that was almost completely done in After Effects. So if you're an illustrator who works in Photoshop or Illustrator and you want to aspire to do a longer passion project video, this might be a place to start. I mean, there's a lot that's involved here. It took us 2 years to make it. And there is some cell animation like this bird here that my husband did, but a lot of it is done in After Effects using keyframe animation, shape layer animation, and there's some 2D effects in there, but this is a really fun one that took us forever to make. But if you're looking for something harder to push yourself into, this could be an example of that. Now here's an example of a completely different direction you could go in. If you're someone who really likes stop motion, or you like photography, or you're really into graphic design, and you can take images and pull them through a scanner, or you can keyframe them frame by frame in After Effects to create this more tactile feel. In level 3 animation, we really get into the extent of the possibilities that you can play with in After Effects. Like for example here, we see a much more graphic-oriented, design-focused animation that's purely animated using mostly shape layers and animated Beziers in After Effects. I also wanted to include this piece because it just really shows the extreme extent of the motion world, where you can go from style to style using match cuts and transitions to create a really fluid animation. It's really great to see a lot more 3D lately in this industry. Of course, we can't really do that using After Effects, and we're not even going to touch on that in this course, but I thought it might be a nice, inspiring thing to see. And finally, I wanted to show you this beautiful piece, My Moon. Of course, I can't show you the whole thing, it's pretty long. But I just love how involved character animation has become in the motion graphics world lately. This is something that you would have to do in either Photoshop or Adobe Animate, or you could even use Procreate. But this is a good example of a combination of After Effects backgrounds and After Effects animation combined with character animation. I love the stylization of everything and how seamlessly everything fits together. This is something that I aspire towards. It's a very high level of animation and concept, so just something to look up to look forward to, possibly maybe doing in the future. Woo, okay, so I know that was a lot of information and a lot of visuals thrown at you at once, but I really just wanted to dive in there and show you the extent of possibilities that you can achieve with Adobe After Effects, but also with Adobe Animate if you decide to pursue something like that. But here we're really going to be going into the simple, basic beginnings of After Effects, those level 1 styles that I was showing you earlier. And I think that's a great place to start. And once you kind of get a knack for the keyframing and everything that Nol will explain to you in parts 3 and 4, you'll really open a bunch of doors to start working in, different levels. So from there, let's get started breaking down my process from the beginning. I will kind of go over, storyboarding on the most basic level to kind of show you how the animation process typically works. And then we'll actually open up Photoshop and kind of get in there and start looking at all the settings that we need to use in order to start working in After Effects. Let's actually learn about some process now. Of course, you're not coming to this Adobe lab to learn how to create a short film from scratch. But I figured it would be nice to give you a little behind the scenes look at what goes into a more complex animation, i.e. that level 3 animation. And if you are looking to go into a career in motion, this is a great kind of behind the scenes look at how the process works every day for designers in motion. Or animators if you also want to go that route as well, but speaking from my perspective, we're going to look at the design side. My typical day of work usually involves designing for commercial animation. i.e. we're working on 30-second animated commercials for companies like Hulu or Amazon or Google, or perhaps we're doing little PSAs for healthcare. It just really depends on the client. A lot of that involves concepting and brainstorming a narrative based on a script or a story that the client has provided for me or a team of designers. Or an art director, it just depends. Like sometimes I will get hired by a studio who wants to bring me on as a designer, or I will be leading a project myself and creating my own team. After we've concepted some ideas and created some mood boards, I typically get into the storyboarding phase. The storyboarding phase is where you really visually sketch out a narrative over multiple frames, aligning to the script or story. Here is where we really hone in on what the story is. What story do you want to tell with your animation? From here, after the storyboard is approved by the client, I begin to actually design out each style frame in much more detail. And once those are approved, I pass my design files off to be animated by an animation team. Sometimes these teams are small with just me as a designer and one animator, or there's other times where there's a team of 5 designers and 10 to 15 animators. It really just depends on the project, budget, and timeline. So, since I just kind of told you about that whole animation process from a designer's perspective, I kind of want to show you some behind the scenes of my projects that I worked on. Now, y'all just saw me show a little tidbit of that cocoon project that I worked on with my husband. Here's kind of where we started. You can definitely see where we got some of our style influence, and it really shows through in the end. We always kind of start with mood boards after reading the script. And then from there, we see how that script really makes us feel. What kind of emotion are we trying to evoke? And what is the message the client wants to tell? In this case, the producer, Dan Stevers, the man who hired us, he really wanted to portray a sense of deep grief and loss. So that was kind of the look we were going for here. It wanted to feel dark, but then in the end, hopeful. From there, we move on to the storyboarding phase. Now, this is just one page of about 10 pages of storyboards, so there was a long process involving that. But you can see here that if I jump to the next slide, this was my design frame. It looks very different from the storyboard. In frame 11, that's essentially what we see here in this image. So the storyboarding phase is more about figuring out the layout and the content, not necessarily what the design will look like. So you can be a lot more loose in the storyboarding phase, just like you are with concepting designs and everything. So here's that frame, and then here's kind of what it looked like once it was animated, once Tyler put his magic on it. But of course, this is just one chunk of the overall piece, but just a little snippet here for you to see. I also worked on this social media post with my friend Justin Laws. The concept behind this was just spring allergies. We wanted to make something cute and fun for people to relate to. This was just a quick little animation thing we decided to do for fun. So this was my process behind the story. I really liked this kind of retro style dog, and I wanted him to kind of just explode into pieces as he sneezed. And that's what the illustration ended up looking like. Because it was not a client project, I could be a little bit more free and loose with it. And then here's the final animation. Justin actually brought it into 3D, so you can see how 2D design can really inform 3D animation. He also used a combination of After Effects, which was really nice. And it's really cute that it loops too, so it's really great for Instagram. But going back to the design phase, I typically illustrate in Photoshop. A lot of other designers in the motion industry do too. Why Photoshop, you ask? Why not Illustrator? Well, that's a great question. I'm not very fluent in Illustrator personally, so all of the techniques I teach here will be for Photoshop. But Illustrator is actually really great for animation, and I'll show you why. If you create a vector illustration, it's much more scalable for animation, and vector shapes import into After Effects as shape layers, which are easy to manipulate using Beziers and points. And side note to keep in mind, After Effects is actually a raster program, but it can handle vector shapes pretty well, so that's why those vector shapes that I imported into After Effects turn more into shapes, because they already use those Beziers that we have available to us in Illustrator. And here's a Photoshop file that I imported. It's the same shape, but it's just on a flat layer, therefore it's rasterized, and as you can see when you zoom in, it's a lot more pixelated, and we're not able to play with the Beziers. it's finicky, but sometimes shape layers from Photoshop will import as shapes into After Effects, but it's kind of tricky and it doesn't always work. So again, why would I use Photoshop? Well, a lot of it is personal preference. I personally love using my Wacom Cintiq to illustrate. It feels a lot more like drawing on paper than illustrating using Beziers like you would in Illustrator. In addition, I really love adding fun texture and lighting to my illustrations. It's much more difficult to do that using Illustrator, as vector textures can get really heavy and weigh down the file. So if you're going to use a Photoshop file to animate here, there's a few key things we need to take into account before we dive in. But PS, if you have an Illustrator or vector file that you already want to use, that you've created already for this lab, that's totally fine. You can also use that. The techniques I teach you just might not be as relevant. So here's the actual project we'll begin working on. I wanted to provide a little client brief for you. So if you want, you can follow along and create your own design for Motion. Or, like I said earlier, you can use a file you already have. Or you can actually download my project file if you want to examine that and then bring that into After Effects and animate that yourself. All right, well, let's check out the client brief. All right, so we've got this company called Fruits of the Trade. And they say, as a company, we're looking to promote our diverse produce selection through simple Instagram animations. We're teaming up with multiple designers and animators to create a unique look for each post. Feel free to bring the fruit of your choosing to life. And then they have some specifications here, 1500 by 1500 pixels. They want it to be a subtle looping animation. They also want it to be the fruit of your choosing, so I got some free rein there. And then it also must include the name of the fruit. So we have a pretty, specific thing we're going for. They've also very kindly provided some reference, and it seems like they're pretty loose on what it looks like. We've got, line work illustration there. We've also have something that looks more like vector Beziers, and then we have more like Matisse-esque, just kind of cut-out looking illustrations. So it seems like they're really open to style, which is great because I might be working in a different style here. So if you want to follow along with this brief and do your own illustrations, please feel free to upload it when you're done with this 4-part lab and tag Adobe, myself at Wonderful on Instagram, and at Nol Honig on Instagram. We'd love to see what you come up with. All right, so finally we're in Photoshop. You can see I've got my Cintiq set up here, and I'm going to be kind of, facing the screen so I can work on everything. I'm actually going to create a new document from scratch the right way for animation. And obviously, if you're a print designer already, I'm sure your inclination is to create something in CMYK, something in 300 DPI, so it's all set up for print. But if we're working with animation, After Effects really only recognizes 72 DPI. So one trick I like to do is create my illustration in 300 DPI from the start, and then before we actually bring it into animation, I'll go ahead and adjust the resolution. So before I actually bring it into After Effects, I'll make a copy of my print file and I'll save it as a new animation file and change the resolution to 72, adjust the layers however I need to make it better for animation. We'll get into that more thoroughly after I'm actually done with my design, but for right now I'm going to work in 300 DPI so that I can have it as a print image later on. But I will use RGB color because it's a lot more accurate and I can see it on the screen. I want to know how it's going to look on the actual Instagram animation. So we're going to start with 1500 by 1500 pixels like they mentioned in their specifications, and then I'm actually going to make my resolution 300 DPI because I really want to be able to actually print it later, if I want to sell this illustration on my website or something. So that's kind of where I'm going to start. And always save your work. So I'm just going to name it Fruits of the Trade Design 01. So we have our RGB file set up, 300 DPI, 1500 by 1500 pixels. And also, if you're looking at the mode and you look at the 8 bits per channel versus 16 bits per channel, 8 bits is probably preferable for animation, but if you are thinking about using gradients in your animation or illustration, it might be better to use 16 bits. It's just going to be a little bit better and more cleaner looking for a gradient. You won't get as much banding when you export from After Effects, which is kind of just like steppy look to the illustration, which you don't want. You want it to look very smooth if you're using gradients. So for me, I really love clementines. So I'm actually going to illustrate a pair of clementines, and I'll start by just sketching out in Photoshop. And the sketch part doesn't really matter, you can flatten that all you want. But once we actually get into adding color, which will go into part 2 of the lab, you're going to want to make sure all your layers are separate. You're going to want to make sure you don't flatten anything. If you add textures, those should be separate from the base layer. So just keep that in mind, but we'll address that in the next lab. Right now, I'm just going to sketch out my illustration. We'll go through a little time lapse of that, and then we can start thinking more about the actual color and everything. And sometimes I still use shape layers because it makes a more perfect circle. So that's what I'm going to do here for these clementines. I always start with my rough sketch, and then I bring it to a more complete sketch. Alright, so there's where I got with my sketch for today. I know we didn't really get into any of the actual animation part. If you are going to go ahead and work on your sketch tonight, that's great. I just want you to keep a couple things in mind before we move into the next part of the lab. I will go into this in more detail, but essentially, if you're going to start coloring it in, just make sure you don't flatten any of your layers, and I'll go into why that's important next time. Don't crop anything out of the frame because it's going to be a little bit more difficult to animate at this time. And if you're planning on adding textures, why don't you save that for after the next lab, because I'll actually go into some detail about how textures work in animation and best practices for that. So yeah, here's kind of where we ended up for today. I know it was a lot of introduction to the animation world, and we didn't really get too far into the actual designing for animation. But I assure you, part 2 will be full of that information, and we'll get really into the actual designing phase. So to recap, today we went over, the different varying levels of animation, and we talked about how we're going to be focusing on level 1 animation, which is basic keyframe animation, adding some subtle movement to our illustrations and our artwork that we've already created. We also went over the animation process in the commercial world, like what I do on a day-to-day, kind of gives you some insight into what you could potentially pursue. We also talked about storyboarding and creating a narrative from scratch. And then finally, I opened up my Photoshop file to kind of give you some tips on how to create those illustrations from scratch, making sure we know the difference, between 300 and 72 DPI, also working in RGB color versus CMYK color, and then kind of got started sketching based on a client brief. Thank you so much for joining part 1 of this 4-part lab series. I'm really excited to meet you in part 2 of the lab, where we finish up this illustration and then we create a duplicate file to make it ready for After Effects. And we'll hand that file over to Nol, where he'll teach you to actually animate in After Effects, which is really exciting. And don't forget, if you want to learn more on this topic, check out my School of Motion course called Illustration for Motion. It's a full-fledged 12-week animation course where we have assignments similar to this one. We go into a lot more detail about client work and animation briefs and working with an animator, and also creating storyboards from scratch, looking at transitions and ways to manipulate images and animations. So there's a lot there. And I can't really wrap it all up in, a 4-part lab series. So I really hope you check it out. All right, well, I'll see you soon. Bye.